I never thought that my story would begin in the shadows of the Cathedral of San Miguel, in the old heart of Lima. The humid August air seeped through the cracks in the colonial walls, bringing with it the aroma of old incense and wet wood. I was standing, 7 months pregnant, feeling the weight of my world crumble as Carlos, my husband's hand let go of mine for the last time. The day had started like any other in our small apartment in Miraflores. Carlos had been distant for weeks, but I attributed it to the stress of his job at the bank and the changes my accident had brought to our lives. Just 4 months ago, a car accident had robbed me of my sight, transforming our 5-year marriage into something unrecognizable. Mariana, her voice sounded different that afternoon, as if each word were a stone that was difficult for her to carry. I need you to come with me. Mom wants to see us at the cathedral. Teresa, my mother-in-law, had always been a woman of unwavering faith, although her devotion rarely translated into kindness toward me. From the day Carlos introduced me, she had made it clear that an elementary school teacher was not what she had dreamed of for her only son. Pregnancy, instead of softening her heart, seemed to harden her contempt even more. The taxi dropped us off in front of the cathedral. The driver helped me out, and I remember his hand being kinder than my own husband's. The sound of my footsteps on the ancient stones echoed in the empty space, as Carlos guided me inside. The cold of the Lima afternoon intensified between those centuries-old walls. Teresa was waiting for us. I could feel her presence before she spoke, that heavy jasmine perfume she always wore. "You have arrived," he said dryly. It was not a welcome, it was a sentence. "Carlos," her voice softened as she addressed her son, "it's time. We can't keep up this charade. A blind woman can't raise a child. She will be a burden on everyone." I felt the air become thicker, harder to breathe. My hand instinctively rested on my belly, where my baby moved restlessly, as if he could feel the tension of the moment. "Teresa, please," my voice sounded firmer than I felt, "this is your grandson. Our son. I can take care of him, I can." Silence, his voice cut the air like a whip. "Carlos, do it now." That's when I felt Carlos's hand shake before he let go of mine. "I'm sorry, Mariana," he whispered, "but Mom's right. I can't handle this. I can't handle a blind wife and a baby. It's too much weight." The words hit me like slaps. I tried to catch up with him, but he had already walked away. My hands found only cold air. "Leave her here," I heard Teresa say, "and see if a miracle happens." His bitter laughter echoed among the stone columns. My knees gave way and I fell onto the cold floor. Their steps receded, at first quick, then slower, as if guilt was beginning to weigh on them. The echo of the heavy wooden door closing was like thunder in my world of darkness. I stayed there, kneeling on the stone floor, as the reality of my situation began to sink into my consciousness. The baby moved again, as if reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. The tears began to fall, silently at first, then in sobs that echoed in the vastness of the empty cathedral. Time passed strangely in that place. Without being able to see the light, I could only guide myself by the distant sounds of the city. The afternoon traffic diminished, replaced by the silence of the night. The cold intensified, and I sought refuge, moving slowly, touching the walls, until I found a corner less exposed to the wind that came through the broken stained glass windows. That first night was the longest of my life. Every sound was magnified in the darkness, the howling of the wind between the towers, the occasional flutter of pigeons' wings, the creaks of ancient wood. I hugged myself, protecting my belly, whispering words of comfort to my unborn baby. "We're going to be okay," I promised in the dark, although I didn't know how I would keep that promise. "Mom is here, and I'm not going to abandon you." The memories of my previous life now seemed like a distant dream. The mornings teaching my third graders, the afternoons cooking while Carlos told me about his day at the bank, the Sunday dinners with Teresa feigning cordiality. Everything had vanished in a matter of hours. Hunger began to set in late at night, along with thirst and fatigue. I allowed myself to sleep in brief intervals, waking up with a start at every noise. The early morning brought with it a more intense cold, and I covered myself as best I could with the shawl I was wearing. As the night wore on, I began to remember the stories my grandmother told me about the women in our family. Stories of resistance, of survival against all odds. "We are like the weeping willow," he used to say, "we bend but we do not break." Dawn came with the sound of the first cathedral bells. In the distance, I could hear the city waking up, the first buses, the voices of street vendors, the growing murmur of a Lima that continued its life, oblivious to my personal drama. I sat up slowly, feeling every muscle protesting the night spent on the hard floor. My stomach was growling with hunger, and my throat was dry. But something had changed inside me during that long night. The initial shock had given way to steely determination. If Carlos and Teresa had abandoned me here expecting me to give up, they were very wrong. I began to move through the space, using my hands to guide me. I needed to know my surroundings, find resources, create a plan. It was not only my life that was at stake, but also that of my unborn child. Each step was an act of rebellion against those who had condemned us to this fate. The cathedral, which should have been my tomb according to Teresa's plans, would become my refuge. And I, who according to them was too weak to be a mother, would show them that true strength comes from necessity. The first rays of the sun were beginning to warm the walls of St. Michael's Cathedral when I woke up from a fitful sleep. My numb body protested the night spent on the stone floor, but I couldn't afford to rest any longer. Survival had become my only priority. The sound of the first masses came distantly from the neighboring church of San Francisco. It was Sunday, as I could deduce from the special ringing of the bells. A day had passed since Carlos and Teresa abandoned me in this place, although it seemed like an eternity. My first challenge was finding water. Thirst tormented me, and I knew that without water, neither my baby nor I would survive long. I stood up leaning against the wall, a protective hand on my bulging belly, and began to explore the space with more determination than the day before. My fingers slid along the stone walls, memorizing every crack, every change in texture. The echo of my steps helped me understand the size of the spaces I was crossing. I soon discovered that the cathedral was larger than I imagined, with numerous side chapels and secondary aisles. After what seemed like an eternity, my hands found something promising, a baptismal font. The water was cold and clean, and although I knew it was not the most hygienic, thirst left me no choice. I drank cautiously, committing the location to my memory. Hunger was another matter. The noises from the street brought aromas of freshly baked bread and anticuchos that street vendors prepared on the corners, torturing my empty stomach. But I didn't dare go out. Without my sight, without money, and in my condition, the streets of Lima could be as dangerous as they were welcoming. It was during my exploration that I tripped over something, a plastic bag. When I checked it, I found remains of bread and a half-consumed bottle of water. Some wanderer must have used the cathedral as an occasional refuge. That bottle became my most precious treasure, and the stale bread became the best feast I had ever tasted. The days began to merge into each other. I learned to distinguish the passage of time by the sounds of the city, the bustle of the morning, the hustle and bustle of midday, the relative calm of the afternoon, and the silence of the night. The chimes of the nearby churches became my clock, marking the hours with their ancestral ritual. I developed a system to survive. During the early hours of the morning, when the cathedral was quieter, I ventured out to explore new corners. I discovered that some tourists left coins in the cracks of the walls, probably following some local superstition. Those coins became my emergency fund. One afternoon, while I was resting in my usual corner, I heard footsteps. I stood still, holding my breath. It was Don Jacinto, the night watchman of the cathedral. I recognized him by his characteristic cough and the jingling of his keys. "Is there anyone there?" he asked into the air. His voice was rough but not threatening. For a moment, I considered responding, asking for help. But fear paralyzed me. What if he was Teresa's friend? What if I called Carlos? I couldn't risk being found, not when I had managed to create a routine, a mode of survival. The days turned into weeks. My belly continued to grow, and with it, my worries about childbirth. I spent hours talking in whispers with my baby, telling him stories about my childhood in Barranco, about walks along the Malecon, about sunsets on the Costa Verde. I promised him that one day I would take him to all those places. Lima's normally benign climate became more challenging with the arrival of the winter garua. Moisture seeped into every crevice of the cathedral, making my bones ache and clothes never completely dry. But even this became a blessing in disguise. I learned to collect water from the garua using pieces of plastic I found, thus ensuring my water supply. One morning, I overheard two older women talking as they walked through the cathedral. They talked about Sister Rosa, a nun who left food for the needy on the church steps every Tuesday and Friday. This information was like a gift from heaven. I began to venture outside the cathedral in the early mornings of those days, guided by the sound and smell until I found the bags with bread, fruit, and sometimes even a bottle of milk. My world of darkness became populated with sounds and sensations that I would have ignored before. The fluttering of pigeons on the ceiling became my natural alarm clock. The change in air temperature warned me when it was about to rain. The different echoes of my steps told me where in the cathedral I was. Some nights, when the silence was deepest, I allowed myself to cry. Not for me, but for the injustice that my baby was experiencing before he was even born. But these self-pity sessions never lasted long. The determination to survive was stronger than any sadness. One day, while exploring a new area of the cathedral, my hands found something extraordinary, a small altar dedicated to Saint Rose of Lima. The Saint of the Impossible, as my grandmother called her. I spent hours touching the base of the statue, feeling the reliefs that told its story. Since then, that became my special place, where I went to pray and find strength. Loneliness was my most constant companion, but it did not allow me to sink into it. I invented games to keep my mind active, memorizing the patterns of the visitors' footsteps, trying to guess their stories from their whispered conversations, creating stories about the lives of the saints whose statues populated the cathedral. My sense of hearing became so acute that I could tell when someone got too close to my hiding place. I learned to move without making noise, to breathe so silently that I seemed part of the shadows. The night guards passed by me without noticing my presence, and the daytime tourists never suspected that a pregnant woman lived within the ancient walls. The nights were the hardest. The cold intensified, and the sounds of the city became more threatening. I had obtained some old blankets that the faithful left as an offering, and with them I built a small nest in a secluded corner, behind a disused confessional. My baby moved more at night, as if to reassure me that she wasn't alone. His little kicks became a personal Morse code between us. 1 knock meant, "I'm here," 2, "I'm hungry," 3, "Everything will be fine." At least, that's how I interpreted it, finding solace in these little rituals. One afternoon of particular despair, when hunger and fatigue threatened to overcome my resolve, something extraordinary happened. A girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, broke away from her group of tourists and approached my corner. I don't know what attracted her, maybe fate. "Why are you crying, lady?" he asked with the innocence of his age. I was startled, I hadn't heard her approach. "I'm not crying, little one," I whispered back, though silent tears rolled down my cheeks. "Here," he said, and I felt something soft touch my hand. It was a sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "My mom says we have to share." Before I could thank her, I heard a woman's worried voice calling out to her. The girl left as quietly as she had arrived, but her small act of kindness gave me strength for several more days. As the weeks passed, I developed a sixth sense for identifying the busiest days in the cathedral. Sundays were the busiest, with masses every 2 hours. On Thursdays, groups of tourists arrived with their guides speaking in several languages. Saturdays were wedding days, and the aroma of fresh flowers filled the air. These patterns helped me plan my movements. During masses, I hid in the farthest areas. When tourists were plentiful, I blended in with the general murmur to move more freely. The moments of silence were for exploring and looking for resources. My pregnancy was progressing, and with it, the need to prepare myself for the inevitable. I began accumulating scraps of clean cloth I found, saving extra water in empty bottles, memorizing the shortest path to all possible exits. I didn't know when the time would come, but I was determined to be as prepared as possible. The night my son decided to come into the world, Lima was being hit by one of the worst storms it had experienced in years. The wind howled between the cathedral towers like a wounded animal, and the rain beat against the stained glass windows with a fury that seemed supernatural. It was as if the sky itself wanted to witness what was about to happen. The first contractions began in the evening. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was the normal discomfort I had been feeling for the past few weeks. But there was something different about the pain, something more intense and rhythmic. My body, which had become my only reliable calendar, was telling me that the time had come. I was in my usual corner, behind the abandoned confessional, where I had created a small shelter with old blankets and pieces of fabric that I had been collecting. The space smelled of stale incense and damp wood, but it was home, the only one I had known for the past 2 months. "Not yet, little one," I whispered, caressing my belly. "Not with this storm." But my son had other plans. The contractions intensified as the hours passed. I tried to remember everything I had learned in the childbirth classes I had attended with Carlos, before the accident, before everything fell apart. Deep breathing, gentle movements, stay calm. But it was different being alone, in total darkness, with only the echo of the storm for company. I moved slowly towards the altar of St. Rose, my place of comfort during all this time. The contractions were becoming more frequent, and I had to stop several times along the way, leaning against the cold walls, breathing deeply as the pain coursed through my body. "Santa Rosita," I whispered when I finally reached the altar, "help me right now. Don't leave me alone." My words were mixed with a particularly loud thunder that shook the foundations of the cathedral. The pain became more intense, more urgent. I knelt on the blankets I had brought with me, resting my back against the base of the altar. Sweat ran down my forehead despite the cold, and my hands shook as I tried to organize the clean rags I had saved for this moment. Somewhere in the city, the cathedral bells struck midnight. Each bell resonated in my head like a hammer, mixing with the pain of the contractions. I thought about my mother, who had died years ago, and all the stories she had told me about my own birth. "You came quickly," he used to say, as if you were in a hurry to see the world. One particularly strong contraction made me scream, and the sound bounced off the stone walls, amplified by the acoustics of the room. For a moment, I was afraid that someone would hear me, that Don Jacinto, the guard, would come to investigate. But the storm was my ally, drowning out my screams with its own fury. The hours became a haze of pain and determination. I moved on instinct, finding positions that helped me endure the contractions. At some point, I felt the urgent need to push, and fear completely overwhelmed me. How was I going to do this alone? How was I going to welcome my baby in total darkness? But there was no time for fear. My body took control, acting with an ancient wisdom that transcended my consciousness. I pushed with all the strength I had left, biting down on one of the rags to keep from screaming. The pain was indescribable, as if my body was being split in two. And then, in the middle of the storm, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, my son's first cry. A weak but determined cry, as if he too was determined to survive against all odds. My hands shook as they fumbled for my baby. I found it, slick and warm, and pulled it to my chest. He was so small, so fragile, but his heart beat strongly against mine. I used the clean rags to dry him as best I could, wrapping his little body to protect him from the cold. "Hello, my love," I whispered through my tears. "I'm your mom." The storm began to subside, as if it had fulfilled its purpose of hiding our moment. My son calmed against my chest, and I could feel his soft, regular breathing. With trembling fingers, I explored her little face, counting fingers, touching her wet hair, making sure everything was okay. The umbilical cord was a challenge, but I had prepared some clean string and some scissors that I had sterilized with alcohol days before. Carefully, following the instructions I had memorized from my prenatal visits, I tied and cut the cord. Every movement was a mix of terror and determination. The first hours after the birth were a mixture of exhaustion and indescribable joy. My son, whom I decided to name Miguel in honor of the cathedral that had given us shelter, found his way to my chest by instinct. The sound of her gentle sucking was like heavenly music in the silence that followed the storm. When the first rays of the sun began to filter through the stained glass windows, illuminating our corner with multicolored sparkles, I felt a peace that I had not experienced in months. We had survived. Against all odds, against everyone who had abandoned us, my son and I had survived. The following hours were constant learning. Every sound Miguel made, every movement, was a new discovery. Without being able to see him, my other senses became even more acute. I could tell when he was fidgeting from hunger or discomfort just by the way he moved against my chest. The news of our miracle did not take long to spread. It was Don Jacinto who found us, attracted by Miguel's crying during his morning rounds. The old guardian, far from kicking us out or calling the authorities, became our first guardian angel. "My God," he whispered when he found us, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "The Virgin has protected them." Don Jacinto brought us clean water and some new blankets. His wife, Dona Carmen, appeared shortly after with hot soup and baby clothes she had saved from her own children. They were the first in a chain of people that destiny would put in our path. The next few days were a different challenge. Recovering from childbirth while caring for a newborn in our conditions was not an easy task. But every obstacle we overcame was one more victory, one more proof that a mother's love can move mountains. Miguel grew strong despite our circumstances. Her cry was vigorous, her grip firm, and her presence filled the cathedral with a life that the old walls had not known in centuries. The echoes of their chirping bounced between the columns like sacred music, and even the doves seemed to sing differently since their arrival. The nights were now a mix of exhaustion and wonder. When everything was quiet, I sat with Miguel in my arms in front of the altar of Santa Rosa, telling him stories in whispers. I talked to him about his grandmother, about my childhood in Barranco, about the plans I had for our future. Because now, more than ever, I was sure that we would have a future. The months slipped like shadows on the walls of the cathedral. Miguel grew strong and healthy, fed not only by my milk but also by the love and secret care of Don Jacinto and Dona Carmen. I had become a kind of urban legend in the center of Lima, the ghost woman of the Cathedral of San Miguel, a whisper that ran among the street vendors and the faithful who frequented the church. Some said they had heard a baby crying during masses, others swore they saw a female figure sliding between the columns at dusk. Tourists took photographs hoping to capture something supernatural, not knowing that the true story was more extraordinary than any legend they could imagine. One Sunday morning, while Miguel was sleeping peacefully wrapped in blankets donated by the guardian's kind wife, I heard voices different from the usual ones. It wasn't the reverent murmurs of the faithful or the rehearsed explanations of the tour guides. They were professional, curious voices, talking about camera angles and local testimonies. "They say it appears mostly at dusk," a male voice explained. "The vendors in the plaza have heard lullabies in the middle of the night. And no one has attempted to investigate these events? A woman asked, her voice tinged with professional skepticism. The church does not allow formal investigations, another voice responded. But we have collected fascinating testimonies. Some say it is the spirit of a pregnant woman who died here decades ago. I recognize the characteristic tone of journalists, that hunger for a story that could capture the public's imagination. Miguel stirred in his sleep, and I knew he would soon wake up for his feeding. Normally, I would have hidden deeper in the shadows, but something had changed inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion of living as a shadow, maybe it was the need for my son to have a normal life, or maybe it was simply time for our story to come to light. With my heart pounding, I stood up with Miguel in my arms and walked towards the voices. The silence that followed my appearance was absolute. I could feel the eyes on us, the shock almost palpable in the air. Miguel chose that moment to wake up, his small yawn breaking the tension of the moment. "My God!" someone whispered. "She's alive." I felt footsteps approaching cautiously, and then a soft hand touched my arm. "Ma'am," the woman's voice that had previously sounded skeptical was now filled with shock and concern. "Do you need help?" "My name is Mariana," I responded, my voice hoarse from little use. "And this is my son, Miguel." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. The journalists, who turned out to be from the newspaper, El Comercio, called social services and medical personnel. Don Jacinto appeared immediately, confirming my story and explaining how he had been secretly helping us. "I couldn't leave her alone," the old guard explained, his voice cracking with emotion. "She and the baby are a miracle from God." The next few hours were an orderly chaos of questions, medical tests, and shocked expressions. Miguel was checked out by pediatricians who couldn't believe how healthy he was, considering our circumstances. "He is a perfectly normal child," declared one of them, which is, in itself, extraordinary. The social workers frantically took notes as I told my story. When I mentioned Carlos and Teresa, I saw their expressions change from compassion to indignation. "This is a serious case of abandonment," one of them murmured, "there will be legal consequences." But what moved me most was the reaction of ordinary people. As the news spread, street vendors, neighbors and worshippers began to approach the cathedral. Many brought clothing, food and offers of help. An old woman selling flowers in the square cried as she touched Miguel, saying that she had been praying for the angel who sang in the night. The journalists wanted to know everything: how she had survived, how she had given birth alone, how she had kept Miguel alive. I told them about the long lonely nights, about learning to move in the dark, about finding strength in despair. "Wasn't he afraid?" asked a young reporter. "All the time," I answered honestly. "But fear doesn't keep you alive. Hope does." The story was published the next day on the front page: "The Miracle of the Cathedral, abandoned blind woman survives and gives birth in solitude." The photographs showed Miguel and me next to the altar of St. Rose, Don Jacinto standing near us like a proud guardian. Offers of help began to pour in. Hospitals offering free checkups, lawyers wanting to take our case pro bono, families offering accommodation. It was overwhelming after months of living in the shadows. A foundation for single mothers offered us a small apartment in Brenya, not far from the cathedral. Another organization promised help so she could work as a teacher again, this time with visually impaired students. But the most shocking thing was the reaction of my former students and their parents. When they heard about my story, they organized a collection and started visiting me. Their voices, which I had not heard in months, brought back memories of a life that seemed so far away. "Miss Mariana," said Luchita, one of my former students, her voice filled with tears, "why didn't you look for us? We could have helped you." The guilt in his voice touched me. Sometimes, my love, fear makes us make difficult decisions. The international media began to take an interest in our story. Journalists from Argentina, Colombia, and Spain wanted interviews. Television programs invited us to tell our experience. But I just wanted peace, a safe place to raise my son. Don Jacinto and Dona Carmen became Miguel's adoptive grandparents. They came to visit us every day in our new home, bringing homemade soups and advice on how to raise a baby. "This child is a gift from God," Dona Carmen said as she rocked Miguel, "and we are blessed to be part of his life." Church authorities, initially uncomfortable with media attention, ended up embracing our story as a testimony of faith and perseverance. The Archbishop of Lima visited us personally, blessing Miguel and ordering a commemorative plaque to be installed in the cathedral. "Your story, my daughter," said the Archbishop, "reminds us that miracles still exist." Little by little, we were building a new life. I learned to use a white cane to get around the city, took Braille classes, and discovered that my experience in the cathedral had sharpened my other senses extraordinarily. Miguel grew up surrounded by love, not only mine, but that of an entire community that had adopted us as their own. The vendors in the square continued telling our story to the tourists, but now with pride, pointing out the places where we had lived in the cathedral. Some even began to leave flowers at the altar of Santa Rosa in our honor. "You see that corner behind the confessional," they told visitors, "a miracle was born there." The morning my story appeared on the cover of El Comercio, Lima woke up with a truth that would shake its foundations. The headline, printed in black letters on the paper, screamed a reality that could no longer be hidden: "Abandoned in the Cathedral, the story of survival that shocks Peru." The article, written with a mix of outrage and shock, detailed every aspect of my story. It included photographs of the cathedral, of the corner where Miguel was born, and of the two of us with Don Jacinto and Dona Carmen. But the most shocking were the details about abandonment: names, dates, circumstances. Everything was there, exposed to daylight. It was not long before the news reached Teresa's ears. He was preparing Miguel's breakfast in our little department in Breña when Dona Carmen hurriedly entered, breathless. "Mariana," he said, his trembling voice, "he's here. Teresa is in the square, in front of the cathedral." My heart stopped for a moment, but she was no longer the same scared woman who had abandoned months ago. "Is he alone?" I asked, while Miguel played happily in his corralito. "No, there are journalists, many journalists. Someone must have warned them that it would come." Teresa, as they told me later, had come dressed in black, as if she were at a funeral. His face, which once had inspired so much fear in me, was demacrated by shame and public scrutiny. The vendors of the square, who had become my protectors, immediately recognized her. "That is the woman," Rosa shouted, the florist who for months had left fresh flowers on the altar of Santa Rosa for me. "She is the one who abandoned Miss Mariana." The crowd began to meet. The journalists, who had been covering the story for days, lit their cameras and took out their recorders. Teresa, accustomed to being respected in her social circle, suddenly found himself in the center of a hurricane of public indignation. "They can't understand," he tried to defend himself, his voice breaking. "It was the best for everyone. A blind woman cannot raise a child." His words were received with screams of indignation. Don Jacinto, who had been watching from the entrance of the cathedral, approached her. His voice, normally soft, resonated with an authority that had never heard him before. "Madam," he said, "I saw that child born. I saw his mother fight every day to keep him alive. And he knows what? He succeeded, without his help, without anyone's help. That baby is healthier and it is happy than many who have everything." I decided that it was time to face my past. With Miguel in arms and Dona Carmen next to me, I walked to the square. Silence fell on the crowd when we appeared. I could feel all eyes on us, but I didn't care. I had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. "Teresa," my voice sounded clear and firm in the silence of the square, "have you come to know your grandson?" The sound of their heels on the stones stopped abruptly. "Mariana." His voice sounded different, smaller, more fragile. I did not know. Wouldn't you know what? I asked, while Miguel played with my necklace, oblivious to the drama that was developed around him. Didn't you know that we would survive? Or did you not know that the truth would come to light? It was then that I heard another familiar voice. Carlos had arrived, probably alerted by someone about the presence of his mother. His agitated breathing betrayed that he had run there. By God! He whispered to see us. The baby. It's called Miguel, I said with pride. He was born in the cathedral, alone, in the middle of a storm. But we were not alone. God was with us, and these good people helped us when you abandoned us. The journalists recorded each word, each gesture. The television cameras buzzed gently, capturing the moment when the truth finally came to light. But this was no longer a show for me, it was my moment of liberation. Carlos, I continued, do you remember what you told me the day you left me here? You said that you could not load with the weight of a blind wife and a baby. But look at me now. I not only survived, but our son is healthy and happy. The crowd murmured, some cried in silence. Teresa tried to approach Miguel, but Dona Carmen brought himself gently. No, madam, he said firmly. That privilege lost it a long time ago. The following days were a whirlwind of revelations. More people started talking. A hospital nurse where they treated me after the accident revealed that Teresa had tried to convince doctors to declare me mentally incompetent to raise my son. A neighbor told how he had heard Carlos plan with his mother how to solve the problem that I represented. The story became even bigger. Journalists from all over the country arrived to cover the case. Defense groups of the rights of people with disabilities demonstrated in front of the cathedral, demanding justice. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation for abandonment and discrimination. But in the midst of all chaos, something beautiful began to emerge. Women from all over Peru began to share their own survival stories. Single mothers, women with disabilities, all found in our history the courage to raise their voice. One day, while giving an interview on the radio, a woman called crying. I am also blind, he said, and I am pregnant. My family wants me to abort, but its history gives me hope. Carlos tried to communicate several times, sending letters of apology through his lawyer. Teresa, on the other hand, disappeared from public life, taking refuge in her home in La Molina. Shame and social rejection had been too much for her. Fiscal investigation advanced, and formal charges were soon presented against both. But I was no longer looking for revenge. My victory was not in his punishment, but in the life I had built for Miguel and me. One day, while sitting in the park near our new home, listening to Miguel playing with other children, a woman sat next to me. By his voice, I knew he was greater. No. He said gently, I met Teresa when we were young. She was always a woman obsessed with appearances, what they will say. But look at him now, her greatest fear came true. Every Lima talks about her, but not as she would have wanted. The legal consequences eventually arrived. Carlos was sentenced to suspended prison and strong financial compensation. Teresa faced charges for discrimination and complicity in abandonment. But by then, I had continued. I taught again, this time in a school for children with visual disabilities. My experience had become my greatest strength. The parents were looking for me specifically, wanting their children to learn from someone who understood their challenges. Miguel grew surrounded by love and acceptance. Don Jacinto and Dona Carmen were still a fundamental part of our lives, and our family had expanded to include the entire community that had supported us. A year after the day I left the shadows, we organized a thanks mass in the cathedral. The place was full of people who had been part of our history, vendors of the square, journalists who had covered the case, activists who had fought for us, and simple citizens who had followed our history. During the ceremony, the Archbishop blessed a plaque that would be installed in the cathedral. In this place, the love of a mother beat abandonment and prejudice. Here a miracle called Miguel was born. 5 years have passed since that night stormy in the Cathedral of San Miguel, and life has taken directions that no one would have imagined. Miguel runs now through the halls of our house in Jesus Maria, his laughs filling every corner with the joy that only a child can bring. Its safe steps and your clear voice are testimony that miracles exist, even if they do not always take the way we expect. Life has given us a second chance, but it was not a gift, it was a harsh victory. After our story came to light, help offers came from everywhere. However, I decided to accept only what was necessary to establish a solid base for our future. The compensation money that Carlos had to pay I invested in education, for both Miguel and me. I returned to university to specialize in special education. My teachers were surprised when I told them that I wanted to focus on helping other parents with disabilities. Your experience is unique, they told me, it can help change paradigms. And they were right. Don Jacinto and Dona Carmen are still a fundamental part of our lives. Every Sunday, without fail, we meet for lunch. Miguel calls them grandparents, and they have assumed that role with a love that more than compensates for the absence of their other grandparents. Sometimes, when I hear them play with him in the garden, I think about how life has mysterious ways to build families. The cathedral has become a symbol of hope for many. The tour guides now include our history in their tours, and it is not uncommon to find people praying in the place where Miguel was born. The plate they installed is still there, and every time he touched it, his words recorded in relief remind me that faith can move mountains. Teresa tried to contact us several times during the first years. His letters, read by Dona Carmen, were full of apologies and repentance. Carlos, on the other hand, fulfilled his sentence doing community work in a center for people with disabilities. The experience changed it deeply, as they have told me. One day, while taking a talk in a Congress on rights of people with disabilities, a woman approached me crying. It was Carlos's sister, Maria Elena, whom she barely knew before abandonment. I have followed your story from afar, he told me, and I needed to tell you that you have taught us all a life lesson. The foundation we create, Light in the Dark, has become a lighthouse of hope for parents with disabilities throughout Peru. We offer legal, psychological, and practical support to those who face discrimination or doubts about their ability to raise their children. Each success story is a tribute to that night in the cathedral. Miguel has grown up being aware of our history, but for him it is simply part of who we are. One day, while we walked around the park of La Reserva, he asked me, "Mom, why do people say we are special?" I explained then, with simple words, how sometimes people doubt what others can achieve, and how our history helps change those doubts. Like when my friends thought you couldn't help me with the homework because you don't see, asked. Exactly, I replied, smiling when remembering how his classmates were surprised to see that he could help him with mathematics using adapted materials. Teaching has become my way of returning to what has given me to the world. Now I run a teacher training program on educational inclusion. I teach them that disability does not define the limits of a person, that every human being has the potential to overcome the expectations that others impose. The emotional scars of abandonment have healed over time, although some nights still dream of those moments in the cathedral. But they are no longer nightmares, they are reminders of our strength. The echo of my steps in those stone halls has become the rhythm of a triumphal march. The community that supported us is still part of our life. Rosa, the florist, still gives us flowers every time we pass through the square. Stiving vendors greet Miguel as if he were the son of all of them. And Don Jacinto, although retired, continues to tell our story whoever wants to listen to it. The impact of our experience extended beyond the personal. The rights of people with disabilities in Peru was strengthened, in part, thanks to our case. The institutions began to implement more inclusive policies, and prejudices, although they have not disappeared, began to be questioned more openly. Recently, Miguel had to do a school project on personal heroes. When he came home, he told me excitedly that he had talked about me. "I told you how we live in the cathedral, Mom, and how you took care of your little alone. My friends said you are braver than the superheroes." His words made me reflect on the true meaning of value. It is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite him. Every day I spent in the cathedral was terrified, but the love for my son was stronger than any fear. The relationship with Carlos's family has taken unexpected twists. Some cousins and aunts who never dared to challenge Teresa during abandonment are now part of our life. They have learned, through us, that love and the ability to raise a child have nothing to do with physical view. The cathedral remains our special place. Every year, on Miguel's birthday, we organize a small celebration there. It is not a traditional party, but a ceremony of thanks. We carry food to share with homeless people, remembering those days when each crumb was a treasure. The Braille system has become a bridge between Miguel and me. Although he sees perfectly, he insisted on learning it to be able to write me secret notes. "Thus we have our own code, Mom," he told me one day, while sliding in my hand a paper with points that said, "I love you." Life has taught us that miracles are not supernatural events, but the result of perseverance and love. Every time someone asks me how we survive, I tell you that the real miracle was not to survive, but how that experience transformed not only our lives, but those of many others. Teresa and Carlos have found their own redemption paths. She, as they told me, dedicates her days to work in a popular dining room in Victory. Carlos gives talks about his mistakes and the importance of not judging the abilities of others. We have not forgiven them by obligation, but because forgiveness has freed us to live fully. The small department they offered initially has become a house full of life and learning. The walls are covered with drawings by Miguel and posters in Braille. Every corner has a story, each object a purpose. It is a home that we build with love, patience, and determination. The darkness that once terrified me has become my ally. I have learned to see with the heart, to listen to the truths that hide in silence, to feel the beauty that goes beyond the visual. Miguel has grown up understanding that there are many ways to perceive the world. Our history has become a symbol of hope, but also a reminder that each person has an inner strength that perhaps has not yet discovered. As I say in my talks, sometimes we need life to test us to discover what we are made of.